Hello, everyone. Life is full of surprises, and that was one of them for me. That night, the home seemed unnaturally silent. My sister was in her room, and I was cramped in my little area, attempting to focus on an unfinished book. The clock struck midnight. The darkness appeared to grow heavier, with only the sound of the wind blowing through the window. A sudden tap on the door rang out, disrupting the calm mood. I was taken aback, but then reminded myself that maybe my sister needed something and swiftly moved away. The door opened, and there in the doorway, I really miss you, my sister-in-law, standing unsteadily, the strong odor of alcohol pouring right into my nostrils, the faint light from the hallway gleaming on his face. A peculiar smile was obviously noticeable. He gazed at me for a minute, his eyes clouded with alcohol, before saying, "Wife, I miss you so much." The words made me freeze. Before I could respond, he came forward, his clumsy arms around me. Then we were. I am Lily. I grew up in a loving household in the tranquil countryside, where every morning began with the sound of birds chirping in the broad green fields. My parents, humble farmers, loved and protected me unconditionally. However, when I turned 18, the milestone of maturity required me to leave my home to attend university. That trip was not only a watershed moment in my life, but it also marked the beginning of stories I never imagined would unfold. I relocated to the city and lived at my sister's home. My sister was married to John, and they lived in a wonderful small apartment in the city center. When I initially arrived, I was taken aback by how quickly things moved here. The metropolis seemed vastly different from my birthplace, from the congested traffic to the towering skyscrapers. But after a while, I discovered that city life wasn't all that weird. People are still working hard. The only difference is that they work in nice offices rather than in the countryside, where they would be exposed to the sun and rain. My sister and brother-in-law are quite nice. The first day I came, they welcomed me warmly. I felt quite fortunate that my sister had a compassionate spouse who always loved and cared for her. In the early days of being here, I assumed that I would be steady and that wonderful things would continue to happen, but I had no idea that everything had only just begun. While I initially came, my brother-in-law and sister maintained a certain distance while expressing affection in front of me. They may have attempted to make me feel at ease, since they knew I had recently moved from the countryside and was unfamiliar with city life. However, after a long time of living together, they began to feel more at ease, and their personal gestures grew more natural, no longer bashful. It began as a simple touch or a grin, but the embraces and kisses between them became more obvious with time. Many times, I observed them being intimate and had to turn away, pretending not to notice, but inside, I was humiliated. Once, it was a weekend. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law were both at home because they did not need to go to work. I had an appointment with some new friends I made at university, so we all headed to the library to study and review. Before leaving, I said farewell to them and noticed they were sitting together in the living room, watching TV and conversing, looking really tranquil. The study session ended fast. In the afternoon, I arrived home, walked into the living room, and came to a stop. My sister and brother-in-law were seated on the sofa, holding firmly. My brother-in-law tenderly caressed my sister's hair, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Not just that. I also saw them sharing a really intimate kiss. That moment made me feel humiliated and unsure what to do. I stood there for a long time, trying to remain cool. Hearing my footsteps, they both turned to see. My sister smiled easily and mischievously. "Oh, Lily, you're back." The brother-in-law also grinned because studying in a group is enjoyable. I nodded uncomfortably, my cheeks flaming, and tried not to look at them. I promptly said, "Yes, that is fine." My sister giggled as she noticed my perplexed expression. "Your face is red. What's wrong?" I was so puzzled that I didn't know what to say, so I tried to be natural and teased back at the eye. "I believe you two are overly affectionate. It makes me really humiliated." Hearing this, the brother-in-law broke out laughing. The sister covered her lips and giggled, and they both seemed quite delighted. She said, "John and I are just in love normally. There is nothing to be bashful of." I could only smile bitterly, feeling as if I had simply stumbled into a bizarre position. "Okay, I am going upstairs." Having stated so, I hurriedly walked up to my room and shut the door. He sighed in relief. My mind was still in turmoil from what I had just witnessed. Even though I understood they were husband and wife, and that such tenderness was expected, I felt humiliated for some reason. Perhaps because I had never seen somebody express their emotions so blatantly in front of me. My parents seldom expressed affection for each other in the countryside, and they were especially reserved with intimate remarks, so this sight was both unfamiliar and embarrassing for me. I sat aimlessly on the bed, attempting to push away the uneasiness in my heart. After all, my siblings' strong affection for one another was a blessing. They had always treated me nicely, as if I were a member of their tiny family in the city. Thinking so, I told myself that I needed to grow accustomed to it, to learn to accept the most normal things in life, even if it made me feel so ashamed that I had to find a way to flee to my room, as I did just now. Even though I convinced myself that this was natural and that my brother and sister liking each other was a wonderful thing, I couldn't help but feel something in my heart whenever I saw them being affectionate. An odd emotion that is difficult to describe. Perhaps it was the melancholy of a young lady who had recently begun her own life, leaving her family for the first time. Looking at how John cared for her, from the simple gestures to the loving looks, I couldn't help but secretly wish that one day I would have someone who loved me like that. Those thoughts persisted in my head for several days. While studying, going down the street, or lying alone in my bed, I wondered if I'd ever find someone like that, someone who could make me feel secure and really loved. Sometimes I see myself holding someone's hand and sharing the tiny things in life, and then I giggle to myself. But that's only Lily and I will eat first. If you get home late, remember to eat something. She hung up, sighed, and glanced at me, smiling. Okay, let's eat first. We began our dinner. My sister seemed quieter than normal, maybe because she wasn't used to eating without John. But she attempted to make the environment pleasant by periodically picking up meals for me and inquiring about school. I smiled back, hoping to avoid the dinner from becoming too monotonous. We all helped clean up the dishes after the dinner. My sister appeared fatigued after a hard day. She sat on the sofa, switched on the television, and relaxed back pleasantly. I fetched her some warm water and sat down to watch it with her. But after a time, she yawned quietly and turned to face me, saying, "I am going to bed first. Sitting too long might cause you to fall asleep." I nodded, watched her enter the room, and then shut the door. The house suddenly grew quieter. I remained alone on the sofa for a few more minutes, the light from the TV screen flickering, but I was no longer interested in the show. Looking at the clock, I decided to go to my room and finish my schoolwork. I locked the door to my room, took out a chair, and sat at the desk. The notebooks and textbooks had been put out since the morning, ready for me to commence my work. Looking at them, I groaned, trying to focus on completing my assignments before the end of the day. But for some reason, a peculiar emotion entered my heart. Small noises from outside the hallway, which appeared to be normal, caused me to stop writing and lift my head to listen. Outside, the home was eerily silent, with only the sound of the wind flowing through the window, making the night appear even darker. That night, the home seemed unnaturally silent. My sister was in her room, and I was cramped in my little area, attempting to focus on an unfinished book. The clock struck midnight, and the night appeared even heavier, with only the sound of the wind flowing through the window. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke the silence. I was taken aback, but then reminded myself that maybe my sister needed something and swiftly moved away. As soon as the door opened, my brother-in-law stood in front of me, unsteady. The pungent odor of alcohol poured into my nostrils, causing me to step back reflexively. The weak light from the corridor illuminated his face. An odd grin emerged. His eyes were fuzzy, like if he were intoxicated. He gazed at me for a long time, saying nothing, until finally speaking. His speech slurred. "Wife, I miss you so much." I was astonished, unable to comprehend what was occurring. "John, it's me. I'm Lily," I explained, my voice filled with concern. But he did not appear to hear. Before I could respond, he came forward, his clumsy arms around me. "Do not avoid me. I love you," he murmured softly into my ear. My entire body tensed. Fear and bewilderment enveloped me. I struggled to get out of his arms, but to no effect. My brother-in-law was so inebriated and confused that he didn't recognize the person in front of him wasn't awake. His words and actions left me feeling crushed and helpless. "John, wake up. I'm not you." I shook and shoved him, my voice raspy from terror. He didn't notice at all. His eyes were fuzzy, and the booze appeared to take over his entire existence. He gazed at me, but not at me, but at another person. "Wife, I miss you so much." His voice sounded harsh and strangled, like a sigh in the middle of intense suffering. He went on, "I want you so much that I can't bear it anymore." Hearing those words, I realized they were not for me, but for her, the person who was always in his heart. Despite knowing he was intoxicated, I couldn't control my heartbeat, partly due to fear and because his words seemed to cut straight through my heart. Despite my knowledge, there was no escape, and I couldn't resist the urge to lose control. My body defied my mind, rendering me helpless in the face of his intensity. I was filled with fear for myself and the uncontrollable emotions. But then I let it go, allowing him to continue calling out someone else's name as I silently slipped into my own bewilderment. He was still holding me closely. His body was warm, and his breath smelled strongly of alcohol on my neck. I was rigid, unable to move, and unsure what to do or how to respond. My feelings were afraid and confused, but before I could think any more, we both slipped into my little bed. The small area appeared to decrease, leaving only him and me. At that point, I realized that all borders between him and myself had been entirely broken. The wind blowing outside the window, the sound of automobiles dashing back and forth in the middle of the night, all seemed to melt away, leaving just my quick breathing and heartbeat. I felt as if all of my emotions and reasons had been swept away. He, the guy I previously assumed would always belong to my sister, was now with me, touching the deepest parts of my soul I had never considered. Time appeared to slow down, extending out every second and minute. I wasn't sure if it was reality or a foggy dream. His every gesture, touch, and drunken whisper seemed to engulf me in a whirlpool of emotions with no way out. I don't recall how I fell asleep, just that it was a wonderful slumber in which his warmth and presence enveloped me. As the morning light peeked through the curtains, I heard my sister yell his name from outside the door. The sound was like a bell clanging, jolting me back into reality. I opened my eyes, instantly perplexed. Looking around the little room, I noticed the bedsheets were disordered. Clothes were spread on the floor. John was still lying there, breathing evenly. His face appeared tired yet calm. I felt an undefined terror rise up in my heart. The events of last night resurfaced with the intensity of a slow-motion film. I didn't know how to handle this. I didn't know how to face my sister or myself. Guilt and uncertainty bubbled up. I hurriedly fixed my clothing, my hands trembling, trying to conceal the remnants of a night that should not have occurred. My sister's voice yelled again, getting closer and closer, and I jumped. My pulse racing, I immediately sat up, attempting to remain cool, but my mind was still in turmoil. I turned to John and gently shook him. "Wake up." He opened his eyes, seeming bewildered and perplexed. "What's happening? Why are you here?" He peered around the room, bewildered, as if attempting to piece together fragmented recollections. We both remained silent for a few seconds, completely perplexed. I attempted to calm myself before lowering my voice and whispering, "Your sister is calling outside. Hide beneath the bed, hurry." He looked at me puzzled, but swiftly followed suit, kneeling down beneath the bed. I immediately straightened my clothing, fixed my hair, and took a big breath. After concluding that everything was fine, I feigned a yawn and strolled out the door with a fatigued expression. When the door opened, my sister stood there, her eyes somewhat irritated. "Why aren't you awake yet? It is almost time for school." I swallowed, tried to remain cool, and forced a grin. I apologized for studying too late last night, which caused me to wake up late this morning. She looked at me briefly before stopping and saying, "Hurry up, get ready, and come out to eat, or you'll be late." "Yes," I answered, attempting to hide my humiliation. As she turned to go into the kitchen, I remained there for a few more seconds to collect myself before softly closing the door. Returning to the room, I bent down and gently said, "You're leaving. She's in the kitchen." John carefully slid out, his face still confused. He stood up, glanced at me, and subconsciously bowed his head. "I'm sorry. I'm not sure what occurred last night. I just remember drinking a bit too much, and then—" I interrupted him before he could continue his statement, saying, "It's okay. We shouldn't discuss this too much. The key thing is to go immediately before she suspects anything." He nodded, regret visible in his eyes. I pointed to the window that way. "I climbed down and pretended to enter from outside when you were not looking." He stared at me, paused briefly, and then did as he was ordered. Every movement was deliberate and slow so as not to produce any noise. I sighed with satisfaction as he carefully climbed down. I immediately changed and organized my school stuff, trying to keep things as normal as possible. I just heard John outside, pretending to stroll in and shouting out, "Good morning." It's quite early today. My sister stepped out of the kitchen, looked at him briefly, but showed no suspicion. "Do you sleep at a friend's house? I did not see you come home last night." He gave an odd smile and scratched his head. "2, I had stuff to do yesterday, so I got home late. Now I'm really hungry." My sister giggled and brought him to the breakfast table. I swiftly stepped out, attempting to appear as natural as possible. Everything went nicely, and no one suspected anything. But my heart's fear had not subsided. When breakfast was finished and my sister returned to the room to prepare, I used the opportunity to say to John, "You have to be careful. This is something no one can know about." He glanced at me and nodded, his eyes filled with shame. "I understand. I'm very sorry. If there is anything I can do to make things up to you, I will." I simply shook my head and said nothing more. When he went, I stood there, watching his form fade away with a sorrowful heart. I knew something had happened that was beyond our control, and I knew that no matter how hard we tried, our relationship would never be the same again. Even though we knew what had occurred was wrong, neither John nor I dared to tell her the truth. My heart sank every time I glanced at her, with her brilliant smile and loving eyes for me and him. I pondered how I could confront her with such a tremendous secret in my heart. The sensation of guilt hung over me like a black shadow, never allowing me to rest, and John, after that night, became quieter around me. We both looked to be striving to maintain an invisible distance to escape any inquisitive gaze. I often reflect on that night, every detail. I'm not sure why I can't get it out of my head, and it's just making things worse. Many evenings spent alone, I blame myself, John, and fate for getting things to this point. But no matter how much I think about it, I can't find a solution. How can I live with this passion without endangering my sister? In the following days, I attempted to avoid being around John. I avoided staring into his eyes and engaging in superfluous chats. I sensed that he was doing the same. He no longer joked naively with me like previously, and when the three of us were together, the atmosphere between him and me was usually oppressive, which made my sister wonder at times. But she never suspected anything, which made me even more devastated. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't allow my contradictory feelings and passions to dominate me every day. So, after many nights of thought, I decided to move out. I informed my sister that I wanted a quiet location to study and work. She first disagreed, claiming that I did not need to go because remaining at home was more comfortable and there was someone to look after me. But I was determined, drawing up all sorts of excuses to persuade her. I am a grown-up now. I want to learn to be independent, I added, attempting to conceal my fears. She glanced at me, her eyes somewhat apprehensive, but eventually consented. If that's what you believe, I respect it. However, if you have any difficulties, please notify me. I smiled and nodded, but my heart was heavy with grief. How could I tell her that the actual reason I fled was to avoid the faults I'd committed? The day I departed, John stood quietly in the corner of the room, not uttering a word. When I pulled my luggage past him, he simply stared at me, his eyes filled with incomprehensible feelings. I didn't dare to stare at him for long. I simply bent my head and walked out the door. When the door closed behind me, I felt as if I had just left a piece of my life behind. But at the same time, I hoped that leaving would allow me to stop my anguish and regain the tranquility I had lost. After moving out, I attempted to begin a new life away from the house, which had so many complex emotions and memories that tortured me. Living in a small room was not easy, but I felt like I had more space to think clearly. However, recollections of that night returned from time to time, particularly during peaceful periods. I pondered if I had made the correct decision by remaining mute and leaving, or if I should have confronted reality from the start. But then I understood that certain secrets, when revealed, may harm many people, and I didn't want to be the one to inflict those wounds. John and I began to communicate less frequently. We recognized that distance was required to safeguard what remained. My sister still contacted me on a regular basis to inquire about her and John's lives, future plans, and the simple joys they enjoyed. When I hear her voice, my heart feels both relieved and heavy. I know she still loves and trusts me, and all I can do is try to live my life correctly so that I don't disappoint her. As time passed, I came to recognize that while certain errors are unavoidable, we can modify ourselves to prevent repeating them. I learned to forgive myself, not forget, but to go forward. I concentrated on learning, working, and establishing an independent lifestyle. The agony and shame lessened with time, but the lesson learned from the experience stuck with me. My story taught me that moments of weakness and actions taken while intoxicated may have long-lasting effects. My error not only damaged myself, but it also jeopardized my family ties. It was an excellent lesson on emotional control, the need to respect boundaries in relationships, and personal and social responsibility. I'd want to provide advice to everyone in any relationship. Always stay sober and appreciate what you have. Don't let fleeting emotions or weakness cloud your judgment and cause you to overlook important information. When faced with mistakes, instead of avoiding them, look for a method to correct them or do the best you can. More essential, learn to forgive yourself so that you may go on. But don't forget the lessons your mistakes have taught you. Life is not always simple, but every obstacle provides a chance for us to mature, learn how to live more responsibly, and build a better future. Thank you for hearing my story. I hope that these shares teach everyone something useful.